It was New Year's Eve, a night filled with promise, celebration, and fresh starts. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. For me, it became the night I learned that some things from the past never really let go. My name is Emma. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York where everyone knew each other's business. My family's home sat at the edge of the woods, a quiet place where the only sounds came from the rustling trees or the occasional howl of coyotes. My parents always threw a huge New Year's party, inviting neighbors, friends, and relatives. This particular year, I was 16, and for the first time, my parents let me invite my friends for a little midnight bonfire in the backyard. It was going to be perfect. We started the night with fireworks, sparklers lighting up the crisp winter air. My best friend Cassie and I laughed as we took turns writing our names in the sky with the glowing trails. By 11:30, most of the adults were inside, toasting champagne and watching the countdown on TV, while the teens hung around the fire pit, sharing spooky stories to pass the time. That's when my older cousin Ben decided to get creative. He told us about the woman in white, a local legend about a bride who died in a car crash on her wedding night near the woods behind my house. Supposedly, she wanders the area, searching for someone to take her place. Ben swore that if you stood at the edge of the woods and called her name 3 times, she'd appear. "Let's try it," Cassie said with a mischievous grin. I rolled my eyes, but the others were already on board, fueled by teenage bravado and just enough drinks stolen from the adults' stash. We left the warmth of the fire and made our way to the tree line. The snow crunched under our boots, and the moonlit woods looked more like a black void. Ben stood front and center, half daring us to go through with it. "All right," Cassie said, her voice steady but her grip tight on my arm. 1, 2, 3. Mary, Mary, Mary. The silence that followed was deafening. No wind, no distant chatter from the party, just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Nothing happened," I whispered, half relieved, half disappointed. But as we turned to head back, a sound stopped us dead in our tracks. It was faint at first, a soft humming like a lullaby. It was coming from the woods. "Probably the wind," Ben said, though his voice wavered. But then the humming grew louder, clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was a woman's voice. "Who's there?" Cassie shouted, trying to sound brave. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by the crunch of footsteps on snow. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her lips twisted into a chilling smile. "Why did you call me?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with malice. None of us could speak. We just stood there, paralyzed by fear. She took a step closer, and I could see the edges of her dress were torn and stained with something dark. "I've been waiting so long," she whispered. Her gaze locked onto mine, and it felt like ice water running through my veins. "Run!" Ben finally shouted, breaking the spell. We bolted back to the house, the woman's laughter echoing behind us. When we reached the back porch, I dared to look back. She was gone. The woods were still again, but the dread lingered. We stumbled inside, gasping for breath and trying to explain what had happened. The adults laughed it off, saying it was just a prank or our imaginations. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with visions of her. The woman in white, standing at the foot of my bed, her cold hands reaching for me. I woke up screaming more than once. The next morning, we found footprints in the snow leading from the woods to the backyard. But here's the thing. They didn't stop at the porch. They led to the windows of my house. I didn't tell anyone about the dreams, or how I started waking up to faint humming outside my window each night. By January 3rd, I was convinced it was all in my head. But on the night of January 4th, things escalated. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was a tree branch swaying in the wind, but then the tapping became rhythmic, deliberate. I pulled back the curtain, and there she was, her face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes staring into mine. "Let me in," she whispered, her voice muffled but clear. I screamed, waking up the whole house. My dad ran outside with a flashlight, but there was no one there. Just more footprints in the snow, leading back to the woods. That was the last straw. My parents called the local police, who dismissed it as a prank. But I knew better. She wasn't just some urban legend. She was real, and she wanted something from me. We left the house the next day, staying with relatives until the snow melted and the memories faded. But even now, years later, I can't go near the woods. I can't hear humming without feeling a chill. And every New Year's Eve, I stay inside, curtains drawn, hoping she won't find me again.
Story number 2.
New Year's Eve has always been a time for celebration, a countdown to a fresh start, fireworks, and laughter. But for me, it became the night my life turned into a waking nightmare. My name is Caleb, and this story happened 5 years ago when I was 22. I've never told anyone, not fully, but tonight I need to get it out. Maybe it'll help someone stay safe, or maybe I just need to stop dreaming about that night. I grew up in a rural part of the Midwest, surrounded by endless fields and scattered woods. My friends and I were bored with small-town life, so we made our own fun. That New Year's Eve, we decided to explore an old abandoned church about 5 miles out of town. Everyone called it the Devil's Crossroads Church. The place had been condemned for decades after a fire gutted most of it, leaving the walls scorched black. Locals said it was cursed, that the fire wasn't an accident. Some claimed the pastor had gone mad, setting the place ablaze with his congregation locked inside. The story was probably made up to scare kids, but that didn't stop us from wanting to check it out. It felt like the perfect way to end the year with a thrill. There were 6 of us. Me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Derek, Chloe, Nate, and Emily. We piled into Derek's truck armed with flashlights, a couple of beers, and the kind of reckless confidence only young adults can muster. The night was bitter cold, and the moon barely lit the frost-covered fields as we approached the church. The building stood like a skeletal beast against the horizon, its steeple leaning awkwardly as if it could collapse at any moment. The air felt heavier as we got closer, like something was pressing down on us. Derek parked the truck and we made our way through the overgrown yard to the broken double doors. Inside, the air was freezing. Our breath came out in white puffs as we shone our flashlights around the space. The floorboards creaked underfoot and the charred remains of pews lined the main hall, their edges jagged and splintered. The altar at the far end was cracked, its once pristine marble now blackened and covered in strange carvings. "Creepy as hell," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible over the crunch of glass and ash beneath our boots. Nate laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe we'll find some ghostly New Year's resolutions. Thou shalt haunt responsibly." Nobody laughed. The place felt wrong, the kind of wrong that sinks into your skin and makes you want to run. But none of us wanted to be the first to back out. "Let's explore the basement," Derek suggested, shining his flashlight toward a narrow staircase near the altar. The steps descended into darkness, and the air seemed to grow colder as we approached. The basement smelled of damp earth and decay. The walls were covered in faded, illegible symbols, and the floor was littered with debris, old hymnals, broken furniture, and what looked like animal bones. But the thing that caught my attention was the door at the far end of the room. It was massive, made of heavy wood reinforced with rusted iron, and unlike the rest of the church, it looked untouched. Derek, always the daredevil, decided to open it. "Come on, Caleb," he said, grinning. "What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't answer. Something deep in my gut screamed at me to leave, but before I could say anything, Derek pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and circular, lit only by the beams of our flashlights. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and on it rested an old, leather-bound book. The air smelled of sulfur, sharp and acrid. The walls were covered in the same symbols we'd seen upstairs, but here they were fresher, as if someone had painted them recently. Sarah stepped back, her face pale. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. Derek ignored her, picking up the book and flipping through its pages. The text was in a language none of us recognized, full of angular symbols and disturbing illustrations. Figures writhing in agony, dark shapes looming over them. "That's enough," I said, my voice firm. "Let's go." But Derek just laughed. "It's just a book. Relax." He started reading one of the passages aloud, stumbling over the strange words. The sound of his voice echoed unnaturally in the small space, like the walls were amplifying it. That's when it happened. The room seemed to shudder, the air growing thick and suffocating. The temperature plummeted, and our flashlights began to flicker. A low, guttural growl filled the space, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Chloe cried, clutching Nate's arm. The growling grew louder, more menacing, as if whatever was making the sound was getting closer. The shadows in the room began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. And then we saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, emerging from the darkness. Its eyes burned like coals, and its mouth stretched into a twisted grin filled with jagged, blackened teeth. We ran. The thing chased us, its footsteps heavy and relentless, echoing through the church as we scrambled up the stairs and out into the frozen night. I could feel it behind me, its presence like a weight on my back. We didn't stop until we reached the truck, piling in and speeding away as fast as Derek could drive. But the nightmare didn't end there. That night, I dreamt of the figure. It stood at the foot of my bed, its burning eyes boring into mine. When I woke up, my room smelled faintly of sulfur. Over the next few days, we all experienced strange occurrences, unexplained scratches on our bodies, shadows moving where they shouldn't, and the faint sound of that guttural growl whenever we were alone. Then Emily went missing. We searched for her for weeks, but there was no trace. The last anyone saw of her was the night we left the church. And then Chloe disappeared too. One by one, my friends vanished until it was just me and Sarah left. We didn't talk about it. What was there to say? We both knew the church had marked us. On New Year's Eve the following year, Sarah was found dead in her apartment. The official cause was suicide, but I knew better. The shadows in her room told a different story. Now every New Year's Eve I stay awake, praying that the thing doesn't come for me. I've moved 3 times, changed my name, tried to leave it all behind. But I know it's only a matter of time. If you're reading this, let this be a warning. Stay away from the Devil's Crossroads Church. Some doors should never be opened.
Story number 3.
New Year's Eve was always a big deal in my family. We'd gather at my grandparents' old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. The house had been in our family for generations, and its creaky floors and dimly lit hallways were part of its charm, or so I thought. This New Year's, however, would strip that charm away, leaving nothing but terror and questions I'll never fully answer. I was 17, and my cousins, Jake and Maddie, were the same age. Every year, after the adults got drunk and passed out, we'd make up games to kill time until midnight. But that year, Jake came up with something different. "Let's play the mirror game," he suggested, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "The what?" Maddie asked. Jake explained that he'd read about it online, a ritual that supposedly let you see into another world. You needed a mirror, a candle, and absolute silence. At midnight, if you stared into the mirror and said, "I invite you," 3 times you'd see something standing behind you. If you flinched or turned around, it would stay in our world. "Sounds stupid," Maddie said, rolling her eyes. "Scared?" Jake teased, and of course, Maddie took the bait. I didn't like the idea, but peer pressure is a powerful thing. So we set it up, an old mirror from the attic, a single candle placed on a table in front of it, and the 3 of us sitting in a darkened living room. Midnight was minutes away. The air felt heavier as we waited, and I swear the shadows in the corners of the room grew darker. When the clock struck 12, Jake lit the candle. Its flickering flame cast eerie shapes on the mirror's surface. "All right," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do this." We leaned in, staring into the mirror. For a long moment, nothing happened, just our reflections staring back at us. Jake started the chant. "I invite you, I invite you, I invite you." The candle flickered violently, and the temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in white puffs, and a deep sense of dread settled in my chest. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then I saw it, a faint shape forming behind us in the mirror. It was tall and humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was obscured, like the darkness itself was swallowing it. "Do you see that?" Maddie whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake said, his bravado gone. We sat frozen, staring at the thing in the mirror, its head tilted further as though it was studying us. Then, slowly, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at me. "Blow out the candle," I hissed, panic rising in my throat. Jake shook his head. "We can't. Not until it leaves." But it wasn't leaving. The thing started to move, its fingers dragging across the glass like it was trying to push through. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, sharp and grating. "Enough!" Maddie shouted. She lunged forward and blew out the candle. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then the sound came, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. We scrambled to turn on the lights. When they flickered on, the room looked normal. The mirror was just a mirror, and there was no sign of the thing we'd seen. "We're done," I said, my voice shaking. "No more games." Jake and Maddie nodded, their faces pale. We packed up the mirror and went to bed, trying to pretend everything was fine. but deep down, I knew we hadn't gotten rid of it. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was the wind or one of the old house's many creaks, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate scratches like fingernails dragging across the wood. "Jake? Maddie?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive, like something was watching me. I turned to go back to bed, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. It was leaning against the wall at the end of the hallway, even though we'd left it in the attic. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. My eyes looked darker, emptier, and the faint outline of the thing we'd summoned was just visible behind me. I bolted to Jake's room, shaking him awake. He groaned, irritated, until he saw the look on my face. "It's the mirror," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's still here." Jake and Maddie followed me to the hallway, but the mirror was gone. In its place was a single long scratch down the wallpaper, 5 parallel lines like claw marks. "We're leaving," Maddie said, her voice firm. We grabbed our coats and woke our parents, making up some excuse about wanting to watch the fireworks in town. They didn't question it, too drunk to care. That was the last time I ever stepped foot in that house. Jake and Maddie refused to talk about it afterward, but I know they saw it too. The thing we summoned wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It had found its way out. To this day, I can't look at my reflection without feeling like something's watching me. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear scratching at the edges of my dreams. And every New Year's Eve, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 4.
New Year's Eve has never been the same for me since the night I spent at the old Ashburn Manor. It was supposed to be a harmless dare, a way to pass the time while we waited for the countdown. Instead, it turned into a memory I can't escape, a nightmare that still haunts me every December 31st. The Ashburn Manor was a decrepit, 2-story mansion on the outskirts of our small New England town. Everyone said it was haunted, abandoned after the Ashburn family mysteriously disappeared one New Year's Eve in 1923. Locals claimed they still roamed the house, trapped in some eternal twisted version of their final night. My friends, Matt, Danny, and Claire, thought it would be fun to break in and spend the night there. "It's just an old house," Matt said, grinning as he held up the bolt cutters we'd need to get through the rusted gate. "What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't want to go. I'd always been sensitive to things. I'd feel cold spots in warm rooms, hear whispers in empty spaces, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill, so I forced a laugh and followed them inside. The house was worse than I imagined. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper that seemed to ripple like it was alive. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the floors creaked under our weight. The grand staircase in the foyer was rotting, its banister splintered, and a massive chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals glinting faintly in the moonlight. We set up camp in what had once been the dining room. The long table was still there, its surface scratched and stained, with broken chairs scattered around it. A dusty mirror hung on the wall, cracked down the middle. Danny joked about how we should reenact the Ashburns' final dinner, but even Matt didn't laugh. As the hours ticked closer to midnight, we decided to explore. Claire found an old phonograph in the parlor, its brass horn tarnished but intact. To our surprise, it still worked. When she cranked it, it played a haunting waltz that echoed through the house. "That's creepy," Danny said, shivering. "Just a song," Matt replied, but even he looked uneasy. Then came the footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone walking on the floor above us. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Probably an animal," Claire whispered. "Yeah, a raccoon or something," Matt agreed, though his voice lacked conviction. But the footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if whatever was upstairs was deliberately heading toward the staircase. Danny grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firm. "Relax," Matt said, though his bravado was slipping. "We'll check it out. It's probably just some vagrants." We climbed the stairs, the wood groaning beneath us. The second floor was worse than the first, colder, darker, and filled with a suffocating sense of unease. We followed the sound of the footsteps to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, swinging slightly as though someone had just passed through. Inside, the room was eerily preserved, as if the family had never left. The bed was made, its quilt neatly folded, and a vanity sat against the wall, its surface cluttered with old hairbrushes and perfume bottles. A photograph sat on the nightstand. A man, a woman, and 2 children, all smiling stiffly at the camera. The Ashburns. The footsteps stopped. "See? Nothing here," Matt said, though his relief was short-lived. The air shifted, growing colder, and the faint sound of laughter echoed through the room, children's laughter, high-pitched and disembodied. "Let's go," I said, backing toward the door. Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut, and the chandelier in the room flickered to life, casting the space in an eerie, yellow glow. The mirror above the vanity began to fog up, and words appeared, written as though by an unseen hand. "Stay for dinner." Danny screamed, and Matt threw his weight against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The laughter grew louder, joined by the sound of clinking glasses and murmured voices, as if a party were taking place all around us. And then we saw them. The Ashburns. They stood in the room as if they'd always been there, solid, yet wrong. Their eyes were hollow, black pits, and their movements were jerky, like puppets on strings. The father raised a glass, his lips curling into a grotesque smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "We've been waiting." The mother stepped forward, her head tilting at an impossible angle. "You must join us. It's tradition." The children giggled, their laughter twisted and distorted. They held hands and began to waltz, their feet never quite touching the ground. We screamed and banged on the door, but it wouldn't open. The Ashburns began to move closer, their smiles stretching wider, their hollow eyes locking onto ours. "You can't leave," the father said. "It's New Year's Eve, the night we all stay together." In a panic, Claire grabbed the mirror from the vanity and smashed it against the wall. The moment the glass shattered, the lights flickered, and the Ashburns froze. The temperature in the room spiked, and a deafening scream filled the air, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The door burst open, and we ran. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air in the freezing night. The house loomed behind us, silent and dark once more. None of us spoke as we drove back to town. We never told anyone what happened, and we never went back. But every New Year's Eve, I hear the faint sound of that waltz, no matter where I am. I don't know what we unleashed that night, but I know one thing. The Ashburns are still waiting for their next guests.
Story number 5.
It was New Year's Eve, and the snow was falling hard outside. My best friend Laura and I decided to spend the night at my family's cabin in the woods, a place we'd been going to every winter since we were kids. It was remote, cozy, and the perfect spot to avoid the chaos of the city. At least, that's what we thought. We arrived just before dusk, lugging our bags inside and lighting the fireplace to fight off the chill. The cabin was rustic, with creaky wooden floors and windows that frosted over almost immediately. It felt like home, a comforting kind of isolation. We spent the evening cooking, laughing, and reminiscing about past New Year's celebrations. Laura brought a bottle of champagne, and we promised to open it at midnight. Around 10 p.m., the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees like a distant scream. "I hope this storm doesn't knock out the power," Laura said, glancing at the dimming lights. "It's fine," I assured her. "We have the fireplace, candles, and a generator if we need it." She nodded, but I could tell the storm was unsettling her. I didn't blame her. The way the wind howled sounded almost human, like a wail of anguish. At 11 p.m., the power did go out, plunging the cabin into darkness. We scrambled to light candles, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Great," Laura muttered. "This is how horror movies start." "Relax," I said with a nervous laugh. "It's just a storm." But then we heard the first knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the front door. We froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" Laura whispered. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. Another knock, louder this time. 3 deliberate raps, slow and heavy. "No one else is supposed to be up here," Laura said, her face pale. I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the door, heart pounding. "Stay back," I told her. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing, just the swirling snow and the shadows of the forest beyond. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. Then came the third knock. This time it wasn't from the door. It was from the window. We both screamed, spinning around to see a shadow move past the frosted glass. It was tall and thin, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. "What the hell was that?" Laura gasped. "I don't know," I said, grabbing the poker from the fireplace. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The knocking started again, this time coming from every window in the cabin, as if something, or some things, were surrounding us. The sound was relentless, echoing in the small space. "We need to leave," Laura said, her voice trembling. I nodded, but as I moved toward the door, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed against us, heavy and oppressive. Then we heard the whispering. It was faint at first, like the wind was carrying voices through the cracks in the walls, but it grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping murmurs. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, malicious. "We're not alone," Laura whispered, tears streaming down her face. The whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched and cruel, like children mocking us. And then, all at once, the sound stopped. That's when we heard the footsteps inside the cabin. They came from the loft above us, slow and deliberate, each creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of terror through my body. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. We had locked the door the moment we arrived. Laura grabbed my arm. "We need to go now." We made a break for it, grabbing our coats and yanking the door open. The icy wind hit us like a wall, but we didn't care. We ran to the car, the snow nearly up to our knees. Behind us, the cabin loomed, its windows dark and lifeless. We climbed into the car, slamming the doors shut and locking them. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. It sputtered for a moment before roaring to life. Relief washed over me as I put the car in reverse and sped down the snowy road. But as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move, didn't chase us. It just stood there, watching as we disappeared into the storm. When we finally reached town, we went straight to the police. They sent a deputy to check the cabin, but he didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. We haven't been back to the cabin since, and I don't plan on ever returning. Every New Year's Eve, though, I think about that figure in the snow and wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed.
Story number 6.
It was New Year's Eve, and my cousin Ethan had convinced a group of us to join him at an abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of our town. It had been shut down for decades after a series of gruesome accidents, and everyone in the area knew the stories. Workers crushed by faulty rides, guests mysteriously disappearing, and the fire that had finally put an end to it all. Locals called it the Hollow Carnival, and no one dared to go near it after dark. But Ethan, ever the thrill-seeker, thought it would be the perfect place to welcome the new year. "Come on, how often do you get a chance to party in a creepy carnival?" he said, his grin wide. "It'll be unforgettable." He wasn't wrong. We arrived just before 11 p.m. The snow on the ground was untouched, and the park was eerily silent. The twisted remains of rides casting long shadows in the moonlight. The entrance gate was rusted and hanging off its hinges, creaking with every gust of wind. Ethan led the way, flashlight in hand, while the rest of us, me, Sarah, Danny, and Megan, followed reluctantly. The park felt wrong. The air was thick and heavy, and the faint smell of burnt wood lingered, even after all these years. We walked past the charred remains of the carousel, its once bright horses blackened and melted, their grinning faces now grotesque and sinister. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame swaying slightly in the wind. "This place is a death trap," Sarah muttered, clutching Danny's arm. "Let's just go." "Not yet," Ethan said, waving her off. "We'll check out the funhouse first." The funhouse was infamous. It was where the fire had started, claiming the lives of a dozen people trapped inside. Most of the structure had collapsed, but the entrance remained intact, its garish clown face grinning maniacally, the paint peeling to reveal the rotting wood beneath. "I don't like this," Megan said, her voice trembling. "Just a quick look," Ethan promised. "Then we'll leave." We stepped inside, the temperature dropping immediately. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and the dim beam of Ethan's flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. The walls were still painted in garish patterns, though most of it was charred and faded. The air smelled acrid, like something burnt long ago but never quite extinguished. As we ventured deeper, the silence was broken by faint, distorted music. It was the unmistakable sound of carnival Calliope music, warped and haunting. We froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Danny asked. "Probably the wind," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. The music grew louder, echoing through the funhouse, and with it came laughter. Childlike, but wrong. It wasn't joyful, it was mocking, cold, and full of malice. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Just a little further," Ethan insisted, pushing ahead. We followed him reluctantly, the laughter growing louder with every step. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. "Ethan!" Sarah hissed. "Hold on. I've got a backup," he said, fumbling in his bag. But before he could get it out, the funhouse came alive. Mirrors that had been cracked and dirty now gleamed, reflecting not just us, but shadowy figures standing just behind us. They were tall and thin, their faces hidden behind masks that resembled the grinning clown on the funhouse's entrance. "They're not real," Ethan said, though his voice quavered. "It's just an illusion." But then the figures began to move. One by one, they stepped out of the mirrors, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't speak, but their masked faces tilted toward us, as if studying their prey. "Run!" I screamed. We bolted for the exit, the sound of their heavy footsteps echoing behind us. The corridors twisted and shifted, leading us in circles. The distorted music and laughter were deafening now, drowning out our panicked cries. Finally, we burst through the entrance, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we reached the gate. When we turned back, the funhouse was dark and silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But as we piled into Ethan's car, I noticed something on the back seat, a small, charred clown mask, its empty eyes staring back at me. We didn't speak of that night again. None of us returned to the park, and Ethan swore off his thrill-seeking adventures. But every New Year's Eve, I hear that haunting music in the distance, no matter where I am. And sometimes when I look into a mirror, I catch a glimpse of those masked figures.
Story number 7.
It was New Year's Eve, and the small diner I worked at was nearly empty. Most people were out celebrating, leaving me and my coworker Lily to close up before midnight. It was a quiet night, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of fireworks popping in the distance. Or so we thought. The diner sat on the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that always felt a little too dark. It was the kind of place people stopped at during road trips, but rarely lingered. That night, the emptiness felt heavier than usual, the silence pressing against us like a warning. Around 10:30, the bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in years. His clothes were shabby, and he carried a faint smell of earth, like damp soil after rain. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded and poured him a cup, my hands trembling slightly. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I couldn't pinpoint why. He sat at the far end of the counter, staring into his cup without drinking. Lily leaned over to me. "He's giving me the creeps," she whispered. "Same," I admitted. "Let's just serve him and get him out of here." The man didn't order anything else, just sat there in silence. At one point, I noticed he wasn't casting a shadow, even though the lights above him were bright. I told myself it was just my imagination, but unease settled deep in my chest. At 11:15, another customer came in, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with a frantic look in her eyes. Her clothes were soaked, even though it hadn't rained all day, and her hair clung to her face like she'd been running through a storm. "Help me," she gasped, clutching the counter. "What's wrong?" Lily asked, rushing to her side. "He's following me," the woman whispered, glancing over her shoulder toward the door. "There's no one out there," I said, peeking through the window. The parking lot was empty, except for the man at the counter, who hadn't moved since she arrived. The woman shook her head. "Not him. Someone else. He's not human." The air in the diner grew cold, and the fluorescent lights began to flicker. The man at the counter finally looked up, his sunken eyes locking onto the woman. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Lily grabbed my arm. "What the hell is going on?" Before I could answer, the lights went out completely, plunging the diner into darkness. The only illumination came from the neon open sign in the window, casting an eerie red glow over everything. The woman screamed, and when I turned toward her, she was gone. Just gone. No sound, no movement, just empty space where she'd been standing. The man at the counter was still there, but his face had changed. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely black. "What did you do to her?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "She's where she belongs," he said, standing up. "And now, so are you." The windows fogged over, and frost crept across the glass despite the heater still running. Shadows began to move the walls, figures that didn't belong to anyone in the room. They danced and writhed, their shapes twisting into horrifying forms. Long limbs, gaping mouths, empty eyes. Lily grabbed my hand, and we ran toward the back door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in, the air thick with the sound of whispers. Low, guttural, and incomprehensible. The man's voice rang out over the chaos. "It's New Year's Eve. The veil is thin tonight. You should have stayed away." We were trapped. The shadows began to take form, reaching out with clawed hands. I felt one brush against my arm, and a cold so intense it burned shot through me. "Help us!" Lily screamed, but no one was there to hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the diner was empty. The man, the woman, the shadows, gone. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the frost still clinging to the windows and the faint echo of whispers fading into silence. Lily and I didn't talk about what we'd seen. We locked up and left, driving home in terrified silence. When I got back, the clock struck midnight, and I heard the faint sound of laughter outside my window. But when I looked, no one was there.
Story number 8.
It was New Year's Eve, and my girlfriend Emily had planned for us to stay at an old secluded inn in the mountains. A peaceful getaway, she called it. No loud parties, no crowds, just us, a roaring fireplace, and a cozy room. It sounded perfect. When we arrived, the innkeeper, a frail woman with silver hair, greeted us with a warm but tired smile. "You're the only guests tonight," she said, handing us an old-fashioned key. "It's the slow season." The place was charming, but dated. Faded wallpaper adorned the walls, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. Emily loved it immediately, but something about the inn felt off. Our room was on the top floor, with a large four-poster bed and a view of the snow-covered woods. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Emily opened a bottle of wine, and we settled in, watching the fire crackle in the small stone fireplace. By 11 p.m., the storm outside had worsened. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the lights flickered intermittently. Emily teased me for being on edge, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the ceiling above us. "Probably just a branch hitting the roof," Emily said, sipping her wine. But the tapping wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost like a pattern, and it was getting louder. "I'll go check it out," I said, grabbing the flashlight from my bag. Emily tried to stop me, but curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, the air growing colder with every step. The door at the top was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the draft. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and boxes covered in thick layers of dust. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing cobwebs and shadows. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then the beam caught something. A figure standing in the far corner, facing the wall. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. My heart pounded as I tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure turned slowly, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Before I could react, he raised a hand and pointed at me, his mouth moving as if he were whispering something. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and bolting down the stairs. When I reached the room, Emily was sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the fireplace. "Emily, we have to leave," I said, grabbing her arm. She didn't respond. Her eyes were glassy, her face pale. I shook her gently, and she finally looked at me, her lips trembling. "He's here," she whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, the lights went out, plunging us into darkness. The tapping started again, louder this time, coming from all around us. It wasn't just the ceiling anymore. It was the walls, the floor, even the windows. The room grew unbearably cold, our breath visible in the dim light of the dying fire. Then we heard the laughter, low and guttural, echoing from somewhere deep within the inn. "We have to go," I yelled, dragging Emily toward the door. We ran down the hallway, the laughter following us, growing louder and more distorted. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls twisting and bending as if the inn itself were alive. When we finally reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled or slammed against it, it remained locked. The laughter turned into screams, inhuman and deafening, and the shadows around us began to move. Desperate, I grabbed a heavy iron candlestick from a nearby table and smashed a window. The icy wind rushed in, but we didn't care. We climbed through the jagged opening and ran into the storm, the snow blinding and the cold cutting through us like knives. When we looked back, the inn was gone. There was no building, no driveway, just an empty clearing in the woods. We stumbled to the road and flagged down a passing car, explaining what had happened to the driver through chattering teeth. The authorities searched the area the next day, but found no trace of the inn. According to the locals, it had burned down over 50 years ago, taking the lives of its guests and the innkeeper. To this day, I don't know what we experienced that night, but every New Year's Eve, when the wind howls through the trees, I think of that twisted smile and wonder if the inn still stands, waiting for its next visitors.
Story number 9.
It was New Year's Eve, and my friends and I were looking for something different to do. We'd grown tired of the usual house parties and noisy bars. That's when Sam suggested we try the reflection ritual. I'd heard about it before, a creepy urban legend passed around online. The story goes that if you perform the ritual on New Year's Eve, you can glimpse your future self in a mirror. But the catch? You have to do it alone. And sometimes what you see isn't what you want. Come on, it's just a game, Sam said, grinning, a little thrilled to end the year. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We gathered at Sam's apartment, turned off all the lights, and set up a large, antique mirror he'd found at a thrift store. It was tall, with an ornate silver frame, and the glass looked warped, as if it held secrets of its own. The instructions were simple. 1. Light a single candle. 2. Stand in front of the mirror at exactly 11:59 p.m. 3. Stare into your reflection without blinking until the clock strikes midnight. Remember, Sam said as he handed me the candle, no matter what you see, don't break eye contact. That's the rule. I didn't like the way he said it, like it wasn't a joke anymore, but I didn't want to back out. The others cheered me on as I stepped into the darkened room, the flickering candle casting eerie shadows on the walls. The mirror loomed in front of me, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light. I stood there, holding my breath, and glanced at the clock. 11:59. I took a deep breath and stared into the mirror. At first, all I saw was my own reflection. The soft glow of the candlelight illuminated my face, and the silence was deafening. As the seconds ticked by, something began to feel off. My reflection didn't seem to match my movements perfectly. When I tilted my head slightly, the image lagged, as if it were struggling to keep up. My heart pounded, but I kept staring. Then the clock struck midnight. The moment it did, my reflection froze. I blinked, but the figure in the mirror didn't. It stood there staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Slowly, its mouth began to twist into a smile that wasn't mine. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection's smile widened, stretching impossibly far. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes darkened, the whites disappearing into inky blackness. It leaned closer, pressing its hands against the inside of the mirror as if trying to break through. "I'm you," it said, its voice distorted and echoing. The you that never escaped. I stumbled back, clutching the candle, but the reflection followed my movements, mimicking my retreat with exaggerated, jerky motions. The room grew colder, and the candle's flame flickered wildly. "Break eye contact," the voice hissed, now surrounding me, as if coming from all directions. "Let me out." I remembered Sam's warning and forced myself to keep staring, tears streaming down my face. The figure in the mirror began to claw at the glass, its nails leaving deep, jagged scratches. It screamed, a sound so horrifying it felt like it was piercing my soul. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the candle to the ground, plunging the room into darkness. When I turned back toward the mirror, it was empty. Just my terrified face staring back at me. I stumbled out of the room, shaking and gasping for air. My friends laughed when they saw me, thinking it was all a joke. But when I pointed them toward the mirror, the scratches were still there, etched deep into the glass. We smashed the mirror that night and threw the pieces into the dumpster. But it didn't end there. Every New Year's Eve since, I've seen that twisted smile in every reflective surface, windows, puddles, even my phone screen. It's always watching, waiting for me to blink.